Hi guys, my name is Dina, and I'm here to tell you... Hey guys, can I get your attention for a second, please? Hi, my name is Dina, and I'm here to tell you about an opportunity where you can really just apply a lot of the leadership and coaching skills that we're learning this year in 1504 next to like a really important program. And the program that I'm talking about is the new Peer Advising Fellowship program that's being started by the Advising Office and has been designed with the help of the Student Advisory Board. And just to give you a brief rundown, we're looking to bring on 180 peer advising fellows next year. You'll be given a stipend of $1,000 for your work. And just to give you an idea of what the program is like, you'll be paired with a group of about 10 incoming freshmen. You'll build one-on-one relationships with them and just help them navigate the very difficult Harvard first-year experience. I know I had an incredibly difficult time as a freshman, and I would have really benefited from having a good peer advising fellow. You'll also be involved in entryway events and with dorm community building events. It'll be a lot of fun. The university is fully behind this program, but in order to make it work, we need really great peer advising fellows, and I'm sure that with the skills we've learned in this class, all of you would be great peer advising fellows. Applications are up right now. They'll be due on Sunday, and Sean will be sending out an email with the link to the program. So I hope to see a lot of applications from all of you. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Tall's gone today, so we can just party. I'm very excited about this. I'm excited to give another lecture. I'm actually really nervous today, and I wasn't really nervous before. So, but I think we're gonna have fun, and we'll have to tell Tall how it went. History is rife with examples of the power that a single individual can have over the course of history, bending the whole world to their will, seducing the skeptics, rousing the reluctant, mobilizing the masses, and overcoming their opponents. These individuals have a power that's undeniable, a power that grows exponentially with every conscript to their charismatic ideas. Charisma, interestingly, is one of the few known social phenomenon that exponentially feeds upon itself. What that means is, according to the law of social impact is a function of the strength of the message, the immediacy or relevancy of that message, and the number of sources. A charismatic individual activates not just one, but all three of these. Therefore, activating the other two, they increase the number of sources through their persuasion. They make the message relevant to us, and they have the strength undergirded by the respect that we have for them, for something that they're good at. When this occurs, when these activate each other mutually, it ignites a firestorm whose greatest strength and greatest weakness is the sway it has over the individual and the collective will. I'm from Waco, Texas originally, and I've seen David Koresh organize 131 followers behind him, convincing them that he was the Messiah, ultimately ending in a standoff with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, and ending and culminating in the loss of 70 lives, 21 of whom were children. I've seen what charisma can do. We also, however, live in a world that's post-Martin Luther King and post-Martin Luther. We live in economic security afforded by FDR's economic reforms, in the liberty afforded because of Churchill's resistance, and in the terror of the leadership of Osama bin Laden. We live in a world which is greater than just our world because of JFK's vision that we could go out and see what was outside of just our earth. We live in a world where famous and charismatic and persuasive all seem to blur together, where we read books that Oprah tells us to read, or we fire weapons that Charlton Heston from the Ten Commandments tells us to fire, or we buy shoes that Michael Jordan tells us to wear. We live in a world where a cowboy actor who extolled the benefits of cigarette smoking then led a nation through the smoke and mirrors of the final throes of the Cold War. We live in a world where we can respect somebody so much to make them a presidential nominee of the United States and then trust them on issues as personal as being able to have an erection after age 60. As scholars of psychology and the human mind, the phenomenon of someone rising to such status demands the attention of the sharpest minds to discern what the quality is that differentiates these leaders from the followers. As humans, we're in awe of these people and hungry for the power to be able to bend the world to our will, hopefully for good. We ask every kindergarten child, what would you do if you were the president? Now, there's a difference between being famous and being charismatic. There's a difference between being popular and being charismatic. As Aristotle said, you cannot define charisma based upon the number of friends you have on the Facebook. It's a very loose translation. But think about it for a moment. Martin Luther King was not the very first person to think that nonviolent resistance was a good idea in the face of civil rights abuses. Gandhi was not the first person to argue that violence would solve nothing in India. Einstein was not the only scientist questioning Newtonian physics in the 1930s, nor was Churchill the only European defying Nazism in the 30s. Jesus was not the only person to say that we should probably love one another. William Wallace was not the only person to reject British rule. Oprah was not the only personable female that says it's probably a good idea for us to read. And Jessica Simpson is not the only person to wash her car in a bikini. With the exception of the latter, these people have a different quality, a rare and differentiating quality, a quality which causes them to not only be creators of ideas, but standard bearers of ideas. A quality which makes ideas tip, movements coalesce, and individuals to become binded together for good or for ill. Today we will drink in and delve as deeply as possible and mix as many metaphors as we look at charisma. Today we'll be looking at case studies of who is actually charismatic. We'll look at some of our most fun leaders. We'll talk about the components of the totality trait that we know as charisma. Then we will differentiate between good forms of charisma and bad forms of charisma. And finally, most pertinent to us in the leadership course, we will talk about ways that we can actually become more charismatic based upon the psychological research at our disposal. When I was in high school, my idol was a senior debater who, despite being a debater, was one of the most popular kids in school and had an entire fan club of women who followed him. I too was a debater, although with a slightly smaller horde of women following me. None. But being a debater, I think being a debater and being a freshman were too high an obstacle to surmount in the high school dating realm. It did not help that I was barely 5 feet tall, or voice control challenged, or was striving to have a weight that had 3 numbers in it. After a practice round where I got killed in front of this girl I really liked, my hero started ripping into me for what I had done wrong. Out of embarrassment for messing up in front of my hero and recognizing that my 3-year-older soulmate was making eyes at my hero, I replied and got frustrated. That's totally unfair. I would have never thought of that. How can I ever become as persuasive as you are? My idol shrugged and replied, persuasion is something you're born with or you're not. I feel like that kid in Troy, you know, the little one who's talking to Achilles and he's saying, oh, I wouldn't want to fight that guy you're fighting. He's the biggest man I've ever seen. And instead of responding with paternal encouragement, Brad Pitt responds, Well, that's why history will never remember your name. I was crushed, but I was not persuaded. I was not persuaded because I knew persuasion could be taught. Persuasion could be learned. I knew this because every single round I became more and more persuasive. The difficulty is that persuasion is not a single gift. We fool ourselves when we say that persuasion is a single gift that a person has. Persuasion, rather, is an amalgam of gifts. So too, just like it is an amalgam of gifts, there's something even higher than that. It is an amalgam, one of the gifts in the amalgam that we call charisma. The attempt to increase charisma the way we normally do it is that we try and focus directly on charisma, which fails, because charisma is what I call a totality trait. A totality trait is one which is an umbrella, which is a component of subtraits where nothing else is higher than it. So you can be persuasive and not charismatic, but you cannot be charismatic without being persuasive. The only way to affect a totality trait is to affect the constituent parts, the subtraits, which we'll talk about today what those are. But in order to determine what those subtraits are, we need to figure out what charisma is and who is charismatic. And so for the moment, I will loosely define charisma as an amalgam of gifts that cause us to be socially magnetic. Amalgam of gifts that cause us to be socially magnetic. I'll come back and refine that in a second. But I wrote down a list of the people that I thought we'd probably mention in terms of famous people that are charismatic. But Tal's not here today. We can have a little bit more interaction. What are some of the, just shout out people that you feel like are charismatic that other people would know. Who are some charismatic people? Who? Evan Talbert. That's a good one. I feel like we've all been shaped by Evan. Anyone else? That was the only one I'd actually come up with. Aaron Bird, okay. Larry Summers. Muhammad Ali. Oprah. Oprah always comes fourth. I don't know how she makes it in the top 5 every time, but she does. Who else? Bill Clinton. Who else? Who? Wait, who? I missed one? Oh. Any other ones? Who? Other ones that are famous celebrities that we might think of? They're hard to think of, actually. They're really hard. But I came up with a couple. It's funny, this is a side note, and I'm stealing this from a comedian, I can't even remember which one, but it's funny how we don't know the last names of some of these leaders, right? We just know them as Moses, or Oprah. I have no idea what Oprah's full name is, or I don't know what FDR's last name is. So there's a lot of examples up here. Think about these people, keep these in mind as we go through and discuss the different subtraits. But before we do that, we need to figure out and get out of here some of the myths of what is actually charismatic. Because we have more myths about what is charismatic than we have about what actually is charismatic, based upon the psychological research we have. So let's go through these really fast. Let's reject them really quickly. So let's come up with some of them. First of all, integrity. Kirkpatrick argues that integrity is essential to becoming a leader. Well, psychological research and empirical evidence suggests that integrity is not necessarily as essential to becoming charismatic. We know this because of Hitler, Tony Soprano. I put Bill Clinton. I like Bill Clinton. I put him in here with an evil dictator and with a mob boss, only because first Barbara Kellerman talked about him in terms of the insular leadership, in terms of the ideas and his lack of response to Rwanda, but also because historians say he was one of the most charismatic presidents we've had, but also he was considered to be one of the ones where he's Slick Willie, this idea of him with Monica Lewinsky, and this idea of him being slightly less than a moral paragon. Good looks. Maybe people are socially magnetic because they're hot, right? Abraham Lincoln was one of the most unattractive presidents we actually had. Rush Limbaugh is extremely persuasive and extremely ugly. Janet Reno. Or what about high agreeableness? Maybe you just have to be highly agreeable to be charismatic. Well, no, Donald Trump, Genghis Khan, Napoleon. Maybe good speaking skills. No, again, wrong. Moses was a stutterer. Bill Gates is not all that eloquent. George Bush is not even close. Maybe there's a perfect personality. What are the 5 subtraits of a personality? These are the ones from personality psychology. Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism. No, every single one of these has been rejected as a single trait that is necessary to become a charismatic leader. We have people that are highly introverted, such as Gandhi, or we have people that are extremely disagreeable, for example, like Patton or like Caesar. Or maybe you just have to be masculine, you know? With the exception of Oprah, most of the charismatic people we mention immediately when we think of charisma are masculine. Well, we know that's not true. First of all, one of the most charismatic leaders in history has been Joan of Arc. Wasn't an extremely skilled fighter. She was actually revered for her feminine leadership. Same thing with Oprah. Very few people would argue that Oprah has masculine qualities. Or maybe timing. Well, timing is just subsumed by the subtraits. If you have certain subtraits, then you're prepped when the time comes for charismatic leadership. So we have to reject that. Or maybe you're just born with it. Maybe you're just born as charismatic. Well, we know this is not true. We know this is not true because every single one of the traits that we just mentioned and all the traits I'm going to mention that are actually part of charisma, we can actually change, and we have psychological proof that we can change these. The exciting thing about this, and the good news is, if you're intractable about one trait, if you can't change one of your traits, you still can become charismatic. In my case studies and in all the examples I just put up on the PowerPoint, we have intractable introverts, those who are completely uneducated, those who are disagreeable, those who are short, unattractive, depressed, and or poor. That means anyone can become charismatic, either by learning through experience or by coaching. And today we'll begin that process. So let's look at what I think is actually part of charisma. I think charisma has 3 subcomponents. The first is the respect prereq, and we'll test this against a case study, which I'll show you in just a minute, which will be really fun. There has to be an element of respect. Napoleon was a great strategist. Martin Luther King was a great orator. William Wallace killed 100 men. Donald Trump built an empire, lost it, and won it back. Achilles was the best warrior. Michael Jordan was the best basketball player. Without respect, there is no beginning of charisma. If Achilles tried to throw a spear and every time hit his own ankle, no one would be socially or magnetically drawn to him. If Napoleon constantly drew up losing battle plans, no one would be willing to follow him into battle. If Pat Riley lost every single game, he would no longer be magnetic. And of course, no one would follow someone who bankrupted an oil business, unsuccessfully owned a baseball team, ran every business into the ground, and then before that got C's at Yale. Maybe on the flip side, maybe Bush will be remembered like Lincoln for all the failures that he had up to the point where he took on the cloak of being in the position of being the President of the United States. Only history will tell. Of course, you may think, what about somebody who is the smallest guy on a football team, right? Who has this charisma about him and becomes the captain of the football team even though he can't tackle or run or catch, right? We know people like this. But they're still respected. It still falls in the same trait because they're respected for their heart, right? The worst of the Captain Planet powers is that they felt like that they actually had the ability to affect change, and people rally around the respect that they have for their self-confidence and for their heart. We'll come back to this one in just a second. But just as respect is a prereq, right? You have to have the respect to do anything else, but then you also have to have magnetic means. And there's a couple of subtraits to that. First of all is confidence. We're drawn to confidence. We can judge somebody's confidence as easily as we can judge their mood or their hair color. Now let me take a quick tangent. Think about somebody you think is really cool, like Samuel L. Jackson cool. Think about what it is that makes them cool. And I think I came up with a definition. Just as Csikszentmihalyi says that flow is defined as the intersection between high skill and high challenge, I would argue being cool is the intersection between high skill and high self-confidence. We love it when people are good at what they do and are confident about what they do. That's why people love Kobe Bryant. That's why people love James Bond and aspire to be like them. Confidence is the undergirding quality of charisma upon which everything else is built, according to Brandon, who wrote the 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. But more than that is emotional intelligence. Now, I'm sure I could stand in front of you today and say that I see the future leaders of the world, right? Because you're at Harvard. And scientifically, this is untrue. This is untrue because every study we have in psychology shows a low correlation between good leadership and intelligence. Fielder in 1993 summarizes the work of 5 empirical research studies that occurred, concluding that correlations between leadership intelligence and leadership productivity and organizational productivity were low across the board. There are persuasive individuals that are not intelligent. Look at college scores of most politicians, with both Bush and Kerry getting C's. The best car salesman and the best shoe salesman I've ever met had only high school degrees. Of course, education does not necessarily correlate with intelligence, but what's important is that intelligence doesn't correlate with charismatic leadership. In fact, it has a very little effect of it, and perhaps even has a detrimental effect if we lock ourselves in a library. The reason is because what is valuable is high emotional intelligence. High emotional intelligence causes our personality, regardless of traits, to become magnetic. We have no examples in history who do not possess these traits. In emotional intelligence, Goleman argues that we actually first feel and then we think, that that's the cognitive process that occurs. And if that's true, then all of our thoughts are shaped by our emotions. And there's that famous study of Phineas Gage, the one who got the timping rod that went through his head and damaged the part of the brain that was responsible for emotions. But the rest of his brain, the judgment centers, the cognitive centers, the thinking centers, the rational centers, were still there. However, his judgment after that point started to deteriorate. The reason being is that emotion shapes and guides every single one of our rational decisions, that emotions are present during our rational decisions. Goleman quotes a psychologist at HBS named Zubrov, who said that there was a long period of managerial domination in America in which the jungle fighter manager was the one that was receiving all the rewards. But now, because of globalization and because of information technology, now instead of a jungle fighter, is the virtuoso of interpersonal skills that are the future of the corporate world. Imagine the benefits of working with a leader who have the basic emotional competencies, attuned to the feelings that we deal with, being able to handle disagreements, causing flow to occur at work. Leadership is not domination, but the art of persuading people to work towards a common goal. And in terms of managing our own lives and careers, there may be nothing more essential than recognizing our deepest feelings about what we do. Persuasion is actually a large subcomponent, but we're going to be talking about persuasion later on in the semester, so I'll hold that for a second, but that's the Cialdini book we have. And presence. I think that charismatic leaders have a certain presence because they're present in the moment, and they recognize potentials where other people see only one static answer. That dovetails with any of the research that's done by Ellen Langer on mindfulness, in which she defines mindfulness as being the awareness of potentialities within a situation. If we're aware of these potentials, we become more present. We'll talk about how to shape that later on. But the last part is the transformative means. Charisma is never adirectional, meaning that someone becomes charismatic because they embody some sort of change that we would like to enact or that we'd like to emulate. Examples are all of them: Gandhi, Edison, Washington, Franklin, Hilton. These leaders have powers for the same reason that I believe that this course in positive psychology has become so popular at Harvard. That's because every time and every exposure we have to the readings or to the lecture, we think about the potential that we have in ourselves, and that potential gets us excited. because we want to enact change. We want to be like the people we see are cool. We want to be more charismatic. These people also possess visions. This dovetails exactly with what Tal was talking about earlier, so I won't repeat his ideas of what we need in terms of a vision or in terms of communicating a vision, one of the questions on the midterm. But what's important is they do have a vision. And this is why I would argue that Jessica Simpson, Britney Spears, Jennifer Aniston are not necessarily charismatic. They're popular, but not charismatic. That is because they do not have a consistent or well-defined message. I have no idea what their message is. They are not standard bearers of ideas. That requires that you have an idea. I would have included Angelina Jolie, but I've heard from several people that dissuaded me, saying that she has actually become a leader in terms of philanthropy within Hollywood. That is yet to be seen. I've still received little to nothing from her. But let's see if I'm right. Let's see if these categories actually relate to leadership by watching a very important case study. We could have shown Martin Luther King, but Tal already showed it. So today,
William Wallace.
Can't be. Not tall enough.
He says this must be a fashionable fight. It's drawn the finest people. Where is thy salute? For presenting yourselves on this battlefield. I give you thanks.
This is our army. To join it, you give homage.
I give homage to Scotland. And if this is your army, why does it go?
We didn't come here to fight for them.
Oh, the English are too many.
Sons of Scotland, I am William Wallace.
William Wallace is 7 feet tall.
Yes, I've heard. Kills men by the hundreds. And if he were here, he'd consume the English with fireballs from his eyes and bolts of lightning from his arse. I am William Wallace. And I see a whole army of my countrymen here in defiance of tyranny. You've come to fight as free men. And free men you are. What will you do with that freedom? Will you fight?
Right? Against that? No! We will run!
And we will live. Aye. Fight and you may die. Run and you'll live. At least a while. And dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom!
I don't know how to follow that up. That's pretty good. I was actually thinking of painting my face blue when I came in here today, but had chickened out at the last moment. So there's a lot to talk about. And before I do this, I'm sure a lot of people are going to say, okay, well, William, this is Mel Gibson playing a historical figure, right? This is not an example of a charismatic leader. But if it appeals to us, right, if it's magnetic still, if we watch it in the movies, then we're still recognizing something about charisma that's valuable, right? Mel Gibson actually came and spoke here in Sanders, and someone said, Isn't it odd that there's so many historical discrepancies, like the prima nocte occurred 200 years before William Wallace, a couple other things. And he said, you don't go to the movies necessarily to find out the truth about what love is actually like. You go because of entertainment. But I think we can also learn from the charisma here. Think about how it dovetails with the ideas that I was just talking about. He starts with this idea of respect. As he comes down the hill, people are saying, oh, that's William Wallace, that's William Wallace. He had already created this aura based upon respect for his previous actions. Humility. This very first act in his speech was actually to do a self-deprecating joke, right? And then to shift the focus back onto everyone else in the crowd, right? He says, I'm William Wallace, but I see this in you. And the rest of the story is about them, the rest of the speech. Rigidity, I think this is interesting. I just put this in here because this fits into Barbara Kellerman's idea of what a bad leader is in terms of being rigid. But I think that's also one of the reasons why we love William Wallace is because he was unwilling to compromise like the nobles were willing to. Persuasion, his speech is actually one of the most persuasive, and I think it helps that he actually had music playing in the background. Just imagine what Martin Luther King would have sounded like if we put some music to it. Humor, he started with humor. Humor is socially magnetic. We know this, and I'm giving a lecture tomorrow on humor if you're interested in coming to that one for positive psychology. Vivid imagery, Tal would love this because he talks about them dying on their deathbeds and thinking about trading all of the days before that for just one chance to come back on the battlefield. The transformational idea, right? This is the last part, the transformational end, the one that moves beyond the individual and transforms the world around them. And finally, it was based upon the follower, his speech, not the leader. They're not going to fight because of William Wallace. They're going to fight because they're sons of Scotland. So before I talk about how we can become charismatic like William Wallace and Braveheart, let's ask the question first, should we be charismatic? I would say the vast majority of us would love to be charismatic. However, most leadership research actually argues the charisma is a detriment. This is because I believe that they're misdefining or ill-defining charisma, because they have failed to distinguish between good forms of charisma and bad, or what I will define, borrowing from Eastern philosophy, is ego charisma and transcendental charisma, E charisma and T charisma. E charisma or ego charisma is a type of charisma in which the ego of the leader is the wellspring or the locus of power. This is the kind which creates a cult of personality, the larger-than-life character who, because they're so different from the rest of us, can carry the world upon their shoulders. When we think about charisma, we think about people that are exactly like this, people whose ego pushes the change, who shines so extremely brightly, the shooting stars, the explosive leader that we follow because of their skyrocketing self-esteem. This, however, is the bad form of charisma. Charisma based on engorged egos have a plethora of negative consequences. The first is that the lack of humility actually decreases the perception of the leader's effectiveness, regardless of whether or not they're effective or not. So in Van Velster's studies, they found that the leaders that were rated the highest were the ones who self-reported their ratings the lowest. Also, managers that overrated themselves were perceived by the followers to be less effective in terms of their actual attributes, which is interesting when you think about in correlation with the positive illusion stuff from positive psychology, in the sense that we want to feel good about ourselves, we project an image of success, like in American Beauty, actually to our detriment. Second, and relatedly, and very complex, high self-esteem can sometimes be quite bad. Most times we argue high self-esteem is good. We want to be around people that have high self-esteem. And the root of every definition is the idea of being having high self-confidence. However, psychology demands that we take a second look. On the opposite end of the spectrum from humility, individuals with high opinions of themselves have been found to be more unresponsive to criticism or negative feedback. And some scholars refer to the dark side of high self-esteem. This is Dawes. Because what they found is that people such as gang leaders, terrorists, and ethnocentrists all have high levels of self-esteem. If you have a high level of self-esteem, Colvin argues that you're more likely to be irritated, interrupt other people, and show hostility to other people. Providing further backing for this is Jim Collins, who wrote Good to Great. In it, he argues that there are different levels of leaders, and that there's levels 1 through 5 of leaders. Level 5 being the best, and level 4 being just an effective leader but has problems. One of the most damaging trends in recent history, Collins argues, is that board of directors have actually selected dazzling celebrity leaders and deselected potential level 5s. Let me show you. Level 4, according to Collins, there are a couple of subtraits. First is that they're brought out from outside. They're from outside the company because they've created the stir about who they are. They're a shooting star and they have extremely large egos. What they found in these studies is that 2/3 of the companies they found led by level 4 individuals that had these dazzling stars were run into the ground by the ego of the leader. Also, the ambition is for the self. If you look at their speeches, the way that they describe themselves and the way they describe the mission is about them, is egocentric. And finally, the mirror in the window. When it comes to praise, when they look in the mirror, they see and hear the praise for their accomplishments. When they think about criticism, they look out the window onto the rest of the people that are working in their factory or wherever else they're working. The mirror in the window. Level 5, on the other hand, come from inside the company. They've worked their way up. They have extreme levels of, they have levels of humility, which are higher, more humble, and dedicated to the direction of the firm. The ambition is for the company. Their speeches rally around the ideas of what's good for the company instead of their ideas. And finally, in terms of the mirror in the window, they deflect praise and they accept blame. So when they look in the mirror, they're willing to accept the things that are wrong, and when they look out the window, they see all the wonderful things that have occurred within their company. This is what we saw actually with David Koresh. And I'd spend more time on the case study, but I want to get to the ways that we can actually be more charismatic in this talk, because I think that's the important part. But if you don't know what happened, in my hometown of Waco, David Koresh convinced 131 people that he was the Messiah. He argued that he was the reincarnation of both King David and King Cyrus of Persia, and had been appointed by God to rebuild the temple and destroy Babylon. In other words, Koresh claimed to be the Messiah. He was a dyslexic high school dropout, born to an unwed teenage mother, who became extremely, extremely charismatic. He justified his licentiousness by explaining that God had directed him to do the most devilish of human things, to test the belief of his followers. In other words, whereas in the original Christian story, Christ was not sinful, he provided a better Messiah because he was sinful and therefore could relate better to sinful humanity. The ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, did a raid upon his compound when they found out he was amassing weapons for a final battle with the devil. And unfortunately, I don't know if you know this part of the story. This is insane. I was reading about this online. I didn't even know some of this stuff. The local news station, so the ATF hired an ambulance so that there could be an ambulance on the scene in case anyone was in trouble. The ambulance tipped off the newspaper. The newspaper then sent a photographer to go find this compound, which no one necessarily knew where it was, so he asked a mailman. The mailman was the brother-in-law of David Koresh. So by the time the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms came, there were 131 followers already expecting them to come. As a result of that, several ATF agents died in a gun battle, and 6 Davidians died, and a 51-day standoff occurred. At the end of it, to make a long story short, 70 people died in a fire at the end of the standoff, 21 of whom were children. Timothy McVeigh, interestingly enough, was one of the civilians standing outside the police lines, which is where I got to see part of this. Like some other terrifying leaders that we have, like Charles Manson, Koresh was able to persuade his followers to go to extraordinary lengths. So Koresh was wrong, right? This is bad leadership. His followers, some of his followers, still today go out to the charred remains 13 years later, waiting for the return of the Messiah. So what are the arguments against Koresh being charismatic? He was crazy, his followers were crazy, or they were brainwashed, they were just brainwashed children? Actually, several of them held advanced degrees, graduate degrees. 2/3 of them were not children. In fact, here's a quote from one of the survivors. "I'm over 21, intelligent, and I could have walked away at any time. I chose to stay. He doesn't keep you. You can leave. What you do have to understand, though, is that he keeps you there by emotion. When you're down there, it's all so exciting. You don't know what he'll come up with next. I guess everyone is looking for a utopia or a Shangri-La." Now, let me save you some time. If you're looking for paradise, it's probably not in Waco, Texas. But what we're left with is a leader who fits our categories of charisma, right? He had the respect based upon his biblical knowledge and his persuasion. He had this magnetic means. He made people feel, in terms of transformation, like that they were creating this utopia. However, it's charisma, ego charisma, based upon an engorged sense of self, to the detriment of others, with the false hopes, counterposed with JFK's vision, for example, of putting a man on the moon. And with no creation of other leaders, only followers, a distorted sense of reality caused by a lack of feedback, blame for the government literally out the window, and no censure for himself when he looked in the mirror. On the other hand, you have good charisma. You have level 5, which I just talked about, in which leaders actually create more charisma by causing other people to become activated as well. Also, think about my lecture that I gave on ethics in terms of the type of leaders that are valuable, and the ones that are moral leaders are the ones that subjugate their own desires and are willing to take that extra step of humility. Also, that we found, Baradacco found that a lack of ego was actually one of the most important parts of being a charismatic leader. That they found there was a quiet, patient leader instead of the huge ones that are spearheading large movements that were the most effective. And people with T charisma, or transcendental, the ones that fit into these ideas of extending beyond our own desires, found that they increased improvement and productivity at work by 33% because they made people feel flow at work, which means that they connected into Shamir's ideas of the authenticity, right? That they felt a connection between their work and their life story. That's what charismatic leaders are so good at, is that they're able to tap into these sources of power where we really want change to occur. If you think about it, if you're looking for a perfect analogy, the Lion King is actually a perfect analogy. I thought about this at 4 in the morning, and I still think it's sort of a good idea. I think it's an allegory for E and T charisma, actually. I don't know if you've seen it, but Mufasa is the reigning king who is loved but provides protection for everyone. Scar, who embodies E charisma, is jealous, power-hungry, and an egocentric lion who is followed by a horde of jackals who only wish to consume without the thought of tomorrow. Simba, the little lion, Simba's arc in the movie is a struggle between E charisma. Think of the song he sings, right, about I can't wait to be king. Kings don't need advice from little hornbills for a start. We could run around all day. We could do it all my way. To the T charisma of his father, the one that his father tried to instill in him by teaching him the circle of life and how he fits into it. Scar, when he's in power, gathers women for himself with no creation of other leaders or successors. Simba, however, Mufasa created and prepared a leader in Simba, meaning he caused more charisma to occur. Because Mufasa seemed to care little about his own pride and thought only of the pride. So, that was 5 a.m. So here's the effects. Increased loyalty, increased work ethic. You don't need to write these down, they're on the PowerPoints. Creation of sustainability, going from good to great. Increased charismatic leaders that cause other people to be charismatic. Increased productivity, increased flow. Whoops. So how do we get this? How do we embody this? Well, there's several ways we can actually do this. Exciting ways. First of all, according to Collins, the best way to become a level 5 leader is to put people first. That actually the people that created the best world were not the ones that started with their vision and then became charismatic. Rather, they started with people, created a vision, and then because of that, they were charismatic. So practice Clintonian listening. Clintonian listening, Bill Clinton, the reason why he was so charismatic, every single person that talks about him and his charisma talks about how they felt like when they were talking to him, that they were the only person that was in the room. That's extraordinary. He knew gardeners and guards at the White House. He made sure to know these people not because they necessarily had effect necessarily directly on legislation, but because he recognized that charisma is built on the people that you work with. So try it. Try and make every single person you meet with today or for the next week to feel valuable in their interaction with you, whether it's a barista at Starbucks or whether it's somebody that's walking past you on the street or whether it's somebody that's in section that you decide to actually talk to instead of just sit next to. Increase your emotional intelligence. We don't have time to go into all of this, but this is a huge field. And if you're interested in this, it's extraordinary. There's tons of material on the web that you can look at this. But you can actually increase your emotional intelligence. You don't need to work as much on your IQ if you're interested in charisma, but you do have to work on your EQ, which is your emotional quotient or emotional intelligence. And you can do this through a couple different ways. First of all, you can increase your self-awareness through journaling. Second, you can perform meditation. Meditation allows us to become more in tune with our own feelings and desires and increases our self-discipline across the board. Avoid emotional hijacking. This is where you allow your emotions to dictate what your response is to actions. And using present language. They actually could teach emotional intelligence to children. And one of the ways that they do this is they take little children and when they're having conversations, they make them use their present language. So it's not, what did you do today? It's, what are you doing now? I'm playing right now. I'm sitting with mom right now. I'm reading a book right now. Whatever it is that they're doing, the more their language is present, the more they think about their actual situation and increases their self-awareness. Well, we can do that as well. And you can do it in your speeches as well. Recognize patterns of intuitive judgment. I think this one's really interesting. This takes a little bit more of a scholarly type approach to it, but sit down or go to the internet and just look up famous speeches. You can do it on the BBC, you could do it on the History Channel, any of these, and watch and figure out what it is that they're doing. The speech I gave you from William Wallace is almost identical in some of the structural patterns to the speech that Bush gave in response to 9/11. Look it up online. I wish I had more time to go into it. But you can find certain patterns of things we're looking for. Also, you can buy something called a speech analyzer, which looks at the intonation that you have. I don't do this very well, but what it does is you try and go up and then down so that little intuitive things that we pick up, I can pick up about whether somebody's charismatic like that, and we all can, right? We know people's confidence almost immediately, and one of the ways that our bodies immediately do that is because we recognize the speech patterns. So you can practice, it's just called a speech analyzer, and you can practice your intonations. Two others. Vision, make sure you have a clear vision. The lesson we learned from Bush, the reason he's become so powerful as a leader is because he's been able to be perceived as having a clear vision and sticking with it. Somehow, Bush has managed to get across this idea that he's a visionary, and we need to find out what it is that makes him seem and have the perception of being able to stick to his guns. One of the ways you can do that is couch your speech content around other people instead of around yourself, like William Wallace did. And finally, is awareness. Know what other people want. I think we all want these archetypes of power. This is taken from Joseph Campbell's studies about all the stories and all the major myths go around these certain ideas of what actually we want. And I think we want the same things, which is why these speeches are so similar. So increase feedback to find out what other people want and what other people think about you, which increases your humility. And related to this, let me just leave you with some pictures of Tiger Woods, which I think are amazing. In terms of, here's somebody who just plays a sport, who plays golf, but it's been transcended to a level where executives in a boardroom think about their boardroom heroics as analogous to what Tiger Woods is doing with a metal stick and a dimpled ball. And that's because he fits into these ideas of exactly what we want in a leader, right? To accomplish something more, sometimes you need to see less. Or it is enough for you to improve your game, or is your goal to change the game itself? People stop thinking about golf and they're thinking, yeah, I'm changing this corporation. Or they think, whatever the condition, waiting for ideal conditions is rarely an option. Or every great accomplishment is first impossible. Think about how his accomplishments on a golf course translate into something larger, something more archetypal, and something we all want. If you're interested in studying this, I'm interested in studying it as well. I'm sending out an email for people that are interested in doing studies like this with me, which will be starting actually this coming Monday. But thank you for being a great audience, and I'll see you guys soon.